Hi, my name is Elizabeth Hatfield, and I'm making this short video to share my work, Montclair and the Women's March, examining the media impact of Bondi's New York Times article with you for the CMCS conference. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there, but unfortunately I live in Houston, and it's been a rough week. So, to begin, this project brings together three media sources that I found and noticed that I felt they were doing something really interesting when I found them in January of this year. And it brings together these three sources to analyze how our culture is making sense of, defining, and continually sort of reinterpreting modern fatherhood, especially in relationship to women and women's rights. So the project began with this article that ran in the New York Times. And the article was by someone named Philip Bondi. How vital are women? This town found out as they left March. And what's interesting about this article is that the original article caused a really large uproar, especially because it ran the day after the march and covered women who went to the march from one town in New Jersey, Montclair, that voted almost unanimously for Hillary Clinton, 85%. After that story ran, dozens of media outlets ran a response to the article. They were frustrated, they were offended, they felt it was sexist, dated, and stereotypical of men. And you can see just a sample here of many of the articles that published responses. You'll see on the top row the one from the New York Times, which was a follow-up from the public editor whose name is Liz Spade. And that article criticized the original article, just noting that it missed the mark. The original article came from Huffington Post, which included an interview with the writer who noted that the story was meant to be a fun piece, but it fell flat and the tone didn't quite come off right. Additionally, there were many readers. Unfortunately, I can't get to my computer at work because our building flooded, but originally I do have a document that noted how many times this article was shared on social media. If I remember correctly, it topped somewhere around 70,000 times between the articles in response, the original article, the shares, the comments, etc. That's a huge number. So a lot of people were talking about this topic. It was a hot, important topic, especially coming on the heels of the Women's March, a day that was really important for the women's movement and that women were passionate about. So taking these three media artifacts together, I'm using something called Peirce's Coordinated Management of Meaning theory. It's a communication theory which looks at how we coordinate our messages to create meaning and understanding in our personal lives. So I'm looking at meaning making at both the personal and the cultural level as how fatherhood is constructed and understood. Central to this study is cultural negotiation of what it means to be a father and how we're all part of shaping it as an overall understanding. Additionally, I'm looking at themes such as identity, journalism and the role of the journalist in the form of Bondi, and gender roles. So a brief overview of fatherhood in the United States. I like to say it's characterized by pluralities at the current moment. So we see different levels of engagement. We see different types of gender roles at home, from traditional to very liberal, egalitarian concepts. We see different family types, from multi-generational to blended to single parent to same-sex parents, etc. We see a lot of family types, not just one kind of nuclear family from the 1950s. And finally, identities. So how are men, what identities are men relating to in relationship to fatherhood, and how are they characterizing fatherhood as it competes or blends with other identities that already exist for the man? I note that involved fatherhood is the new fatherhood ideal. And I think it's important to note it's not just men saying, I want to be an involved father, I expect that of myself, but they're also feeling a pressure from our culture to be a good father who is involved. That part of that good father identity is being engaged and involved with your children and participating in child activities. And a challenge that persists is this notion of the breadwinner identity. It's a great identity. It works in a lot of ways. It's deeply rooted in our culture that men in families are breadwinners, and it's very hard for fathers to get away from this identity. So it remains a primary identity, even though many families have dual income or a female breadwinner. We also see structural impediments such as ideal worker expectations that make change hard. Finally, women still do the bulk of the work at home. So even though men want to participate and want to share the work, women are still the ones that are being left with it. It's a very big challenge to truly split 50-50. And most people may try or shoot for it, but the reality is it's very hard to implement. And so women shoulder that manager role, delegating tasks, managing the relationships, managing childcare, etc. So I end this page with this idea of the gap that still exists. It was identified by La Rosa in 1988, and I would argue the gap has gotten smaller. But it's the difference between our ideals, what we want it to be, what we want the world to look like, what we say we have as our goals, and our reality of what it actually looks like. We may want egalitarian 50-50 parenting. We may have 40-60. That may be our reality. And that gap may be getting smaller. I like to think it is. There's a lot of arguments that millennials are continually reducing every gap, including gaps in pay, gaps in childcare, gaps in gender identity. So the coordination management of meaning theory is a communication theory that looks at how we use context to make sense of messages. That everything is both contextualized by something and is a context for something else. In every communication interaction, we bring our history to that interaction. Each person has an individual history that shapes how they make sense of the world and also helps them to make sense of the world. And that history may not always characterize things the same way for different people. So using this theory, it helps us to understand how is one person approaching an interaction and another person approaching it from a slightly different perspective. So it's useful for examining how each party approaches, how they make sense, and how they work through each interaction to shape understanding. So I have 3 media sources, as I discussed earlier: the January 22nd article, How Vital Are Women?, the 20 media articles that respond to this article, and the 192 comments that were listed on the New York Times response article. The original article did not allow comments. The response article did. So that is where I have collected this data from. Okay, so at the bottom you'll see 4 steps for applying the CMM method. The first thing is a deep description of what you're seeing. The second is interpreting it using several models developed by Pierce. Then it's a critique. How can we put this into play? How can we make our world better? And finally, a practical application for moving forward. So to start with description, let's look at the Bondi piece. Philip Bondi is a 65-year-old sports journalist who was writing this piece as a freelancer for the New York Times. He lives in Montclair, as do many other New York Times reporters. He's a local, so his idea was to just go around and watch what was happening the day of the march. He was home, he hadn't gone to the march, and so he was available. The article was meant to be a funny, when women go to war, what happens, play on the World War II sort of storyline, but it didn't work out. The article went awry. It ended up having a 1980s Mr. Mom tone that felt dated and didn't work. It didn't really reflect the egalitarian values that many in Montclair aspire to or feel that they actually live. So we see some quotes in the article that indicate some of the problems with it. So we see things from Bondi. He's saying things like routines were radically altered and many fathers tried to meet weekend demands alone for a change. There were stark changes of habit and dads exhaled in relief when mom got home. And part of the deal struck was that they got to go to the march and Sunday dad got to golf or play tennis or do something fun, a leisure activity. So we see these things that indicate an earlier time period and do not point to an egalitarian perspective that place mothers as the primary caregiver and dads as the bumbling sidekick that needs mom to get it right. But the parent quotes in the article point to a different reality. We see quotes such as, "We share all of our parenting together." "He's not a parent, he's a babysitter," and other quotes I don't have time to discuss here. So these things pointed to the fact that there were some problems with this article beyond the offensiveness that was the original response by many media and marchers. So looking at the media, what happened for them? I like to look at this term that Pierce introduces called communicative implicature. It's a reminder to differentiate between what is said and what is being done. So for Bondi's article, from marchers and media outlets aligned with the march, what Bondi said was that men stayed home, they took care of the kids. This is what their day looked like. They went to, birthday parties. But what he did was much more important, because his article said the march did not matter and nothing had changed. That these women went off to march and came right on back home to the status quo, and dad got to go golfing on Sunday. So this was really important for people who had come off a passionate day of advocating for women's rights. Within 24 hours, we saw multiple media outlets responding, and most of the articles came within the first 3 or 4 days, critiquing the tone of the article, arguing that Bondi was out of touch, and frustrated by the minimization of the march and its goals immediately after. You see here a quote from the New York Times follow-up article. "If you want to get some women mad, there are more ways than by electing Donald Trump. Try doing what the New York Times did, writing a story about a bunch of fathers in Montclair, New Jersey, who had to endure the hardship of watching their children for a day while their wives attended protest marches in Washington and New York." So our final group is the readers. And the reader group was all of these comments. So I sorted through these comments to try to see what matches up with Bondi, what matches up with the media commentary and the marcher commentary, and what's different. Where is there a new voice that's entering this conversation? And that's where it got interesting. The readers showed a really polysemic reading of this, which means they got multiple meanings. They did not all read it the same. Some people thought it was light, funny, hit the mark. Other people thought the New York Times was wasting their time and it was no longer a place for serious journalism. A big group supported the media commentary, agreed with them, and said, what were we reading and what was this? There were people who said, Bondi was right, give the guy a break. But then there was the last group, and that group focused on the lived experience of parenting, and they were the most interesting. So you could see that they were mediated. Their reading of the article and all of the articles of the whole interactive debate was nuanced by their own day-to-day life experience. And that's a big part of media effects theory, right? That the effects of media are mediated, so changed and altered by our own experiences, that those are more vivid for us. Reading this article, our own life experience is much more vivid and real to us, and it changes our understanding of what we're reading, of what we're seeing, in the media. I thought that the reader's commentary was intelligent. It was a debate, it was discussion with a variety of perspectives. So what we're told to do with CMM and Pierce's method, basically, first he argues, map the turns in the conversation. You can think about this like turn taking, but it's a little bit broader because of the scope of the project. Turn taking in a regular conversation would be hi, one turn, hi, another turn, how are you, third turn, great, fourth turn. Here we're looking at it in a broad sense. And so I start with the election of Trump in the race against Hillary Clinton, a historic election no matter who won, but Trump was the victor. Then we see the Women's March is immediately planned, and closer to the march, Jameson asked Bondi to write the article. So we've got some events taking place. We're mapping the events in this situation. At the end, turn 11 is the reader commentary adding to the article. So if we look at these turns, what Pierce wants us to do is look and see, where did each party believe the conversation started? Where did the interaction begin for them? So I would argue that for the march participants and the media, that the conversation started at turn 1, maybe even before that. But Pierce argues it's very difficult to find the true beginning for each conversation. So you just got to start with something that feels good enough. And what's good enough about this is showing that this was a much deeper and longer running conversation for them than it might have been for Bondi, who approached this from a different perspective. I'd argue Bondi enters at turn 3, when he's asked to write the article. He may have had a perspective on the march that was personal or impersonal. We might not ever know that. But what we do know is that he became engaged when he had a job to do that related to the march. So here's the hierarchy model that Pierce advocates for. X in the context of Y. The lower ones, specific activities, are in the context of the form of action. And you can see here, I've worked through what was Bondi's context versus the marcher's context and the media's context. And you can see that for Bondi, this context was different. He's a journalist, and he was seeking to, in the broadest context, cover the news in an entertaining and accurate way. He had a task to complete. But for the marchers and media, Their context was to demonstrate a great need to push for women's equality, a critical moment in the cultural conversation. But if we work from the bottom up, we'll think simply and small. First, what was Bondi actually doing? He was observing the events in Montclair, New Jersey. What were the marchers and media doing? Sorting through their family situations to find a way for women to go to the march and have somebody watch their children. That's what they did. What was their form of action? Create a news article about men during an event focused on women. Why is this like newsworthy or interesting? That's what they thought would work. For the marchers and media, they were engaging in a peaceful protest through a major march centered on women's equality. And finally, as we've talked about, the major context, the broadest context for both people, I would argue for Bondi is covering the news, for the marchers is demonstrating the need. One is a value, the other is a task. And there's a really big difference in those that I think explains a lot in why the conflict occurred here and why the lack of mutual understanding about how important it was to define fatherhood in a way that was related to women's equality and women's right. Why it was so important for this group as opposed to Bondi, who was really not involved, not engaged. He's a grandfather, 65 years old. He's already raised his children. Fatherhood is not an identity that's primary for him at this point, possibly. But looking to our third group, I think that we get even more interesting here in terms of what we're finding out about why people are not on the same page in terms of what is fatherhood. So here I add a third column for the real life commenters. So in the commenters, the group that didn't seem to say, oh, Bondi's right, or oh, the media's right, or a few other avenues that they took, such as reporting issues or a class argument that was somewhat related to the media marchers' commentary. So I sort of left that aside. This was a group that was more focused on my real life experience looks different. It doesn't mimic exactly one side or the other. And so here I view these people who are readers as defining the episode in the context of here I am, I'm balancing my work life and family choices as best possible based on my personal situation. So I'm reading this article and thinking, does this make sense to me in my own understanding of what it is to have work-life balance? So at the bottom level, they're reading the article, right? He's observing the events in Montclair. The families are figuring out who can go to the march. The other readers are reading the articles after the event and deciding what feels true and what feels like a misrepresentation of modern parenting. That's the context that they are reading this article in. So a few quotes here. Tom Erickson, there's good dads and lazy dads. Not all moms are saints either. There's a lot of generalizations going around. Stacey Sullivan, I have to say I found nothing wrong with the article. I'm a full-time working mom, and I find that I, along with my other working full-time moms, still do a disproportionate part of the parenting. I marched and left my children. It was fine, but routines were altered, teeth weren't brushed, and if I hadn't returned Saturday night, soccer would not have been played on Sunday. Finally, ACW notes, the premise of this article seems to highlight maybe we haven't come quite as far as we like to think, even among the progressive, liberal, whatever hipster set, that mommy still ends up doing the housework in addition to holding down that high-powered job. So when you see each of the deep description and the interpretation of each of the parties that are involved in this conversation, the critique involves connecting the dots for the interaction. What do we know about the big picture when we put these voices together? Each of these voices felt a sense of oughtness, a term that Pierce introduces that means they had a motivation to be part of the conversation. They felt it needed to be corrected. It ought to be a different way. And that is why people engage, and that is why the conversation moves forward, because somebody feels they need to either correct, continue the conversation, and keep going until we get to something that makes sense for most of the parties involved. We saw that quickly Bondi apologized for his article. If we'd seen just Bondi's one piece and 20 media articles condemning it, we would have quickly said, Bondi was wrong. He didn't know anything. Oh, everybody else says, what everybody else says is right. There's so many more of them. But when we enter in this third party, we start to look a little bit more at what was his intention, what was its effect, and what is reality. Because it seems that we might be looking at two polarized versions of the events, and there might be a middle nuanced area that makes a little bit more sense for the day-to-day lived experience of fathers. That is the critical moment that I see in this piece of research. So there were parties with vested interests, and each of these parties, that's what brought them to the feeling of oddness. When we bring in the comments, we bring in a third voice that really seeks to navigate towards more of a win-win situation. It doesn't condemn Bondi. It doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It says, hey, wait a second, there's something here to be worked through and figured out. And it looks at his context as one influenced by real experiences, generational differences, which is critical to this. Fatherhood's changing generation over generation, and an outside observation rather than the lived experience of today's fathers. So what does this mean? The reader's comments demonstrate a perspective that's aligned with what our research showed about parenthood and fatherhood. They showed ideals that don't necessarily meet the reality, but there's a continual striving to be engaged fathers that are a part of childcare, that aren't saying this is mom's job, but they're saying we're going to share this job. And that sharing may not look perfect, but it's happening, and it looks a lot different than 1965 or 1955. In 1965, fathers spent 1/3 of the time that fathers today spend with their children. So fatherhood has changed dramatically. The culture of fatherhood, the understanding of fatherhood, and particularly the definition of what is a good father. So that gap still exists, but not for everyone, certainly not in the same ways. And I would argue each household offers a personal negotiation that may be imperfect in its lived experience. As we see the transition of the meanings of fatherhood, we continue to look how there's generational changes, how day-to-day parenting helps us to make sense of what is real and what are our goals and what's acceptable in our culture at this moment. I think that one thing to look at is this final quote I have here from one of the commenters. Amu notes, at the very least, the article provoked a conversation and demonstrated that this isn't the 1950s anymore. I think that this, as a final point to leave on, is a great point to think about how what we need is conversation. We didn't need to stop with Bondi. What's important about this media interaction, this coordinated management of meaning, is that multiple groups came together to have a conversation and to say, we're not going to stop with this article or the condemning of it, but we're going to work through some deeper understandings to say, hey, there's a lot to figure out here, and we're all working on it together. I enjoyed putting this together. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope we were able to do comments, but I'm not totally sure it'll happen. Again, my name is Elizabeth Hatfield from the University of Houston. Thank you very much.